access the
Recording in
closed captioning
progress.
feature, you'll locate the live transcript button at the bottom of your Zoom screen and then click Show Subtitle. This will allow you to view closed captions in English throughout the presentation. To explain language interpretation, I will now turn things over to our interpreter to describe how you can listen to this meeting in English, Spanish, or Mandarin.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this meeting. I, Giovanna Wormsbecker, and Diana Orozco will be your Spanish interpreters today. In order to provide language access, this meeting will have simultaneous bidirectional interpretation from English to Spanish and Mandarin. Please note that the translation globe will not appear until after I've read through all language instructions. Therefore, we're asking that everyone joining us for this event, please select your preferred language to facilitate hearing presenters and participants clearly, and to prevent technical glitches or interference occurring between the 3 language channels when one is not selected. If you're on a laptop, please locate the icon shaped like a globe at the bottom of your screen. Click on Language Interpretation and then select English. If you're on an iPad or your phone or a similar device, then locate the 3-dot menu on the right corner of your screen. Click on Language Interpretation and then select English. When you speak, please do so at a moderate pace because the interpreter is going to be simultaneously interpreting everything you say. Buenos días a todos y bienvenidos a esta reunión. Yo, Giovanna Wormsbecker y Diana Orozco seremos sus intérpretes en español. Esta reunión contará con interpretación simultánea bidireccional en inglés y en español y mandarín. El globo de traducción no va a aparecer hasta que haya leído las instrucciones en inglés, español y mandarín. Por lo tanto, pedimos a todos los presentes seleccionen su idioma preferido para facilitar escuchar a los presentadores y los demás participantes con claridad, evitando que se produzcan fallas técnicas o interferencias entre los 3 canales lingüísticos cuando no sea seleccionado uno de ellos. Si está utilizando una computadora, verá un icono en la parte inferior de su pantalla a la derecha en forma de globo que dice Interpretación. Haga clic ahí y seleccione Español. Si está utilizando un iPad o teléfono, localice el menú de 3 puntos que aparece arriba a la derecha. Haga clic en Interpretación de idiomas y elija Español. Cuando sea su turno de hablar, por favor recuerde hablar con voz fuerte y clara y a un paso moderado, ya que el intérprete estará interpretando simultáneamente el otro idioma. Now I will turn things over to our Mandarin interpreter. Thank you.
大家早上好，欢迎参加本次会议。我的名字是 Sarah， 我和亚楠是今天的普通话翻译。为了提供语言服务，本次会议将提供从英语翻译为西班牙语和普通话的双向同声传译。请注意，在我们读完英文、西班牙文和中文说明之后，翻译频道的地球图案才会出现。为了避免为选择语言频道而导致技术性故障或干扰，我们要求参加本次活动的每个人，请从3种语言中选择您想听的语言，以便清楚地听到发言者和与会者的声音。如果您使用的是笔记本电脑，请在屏幕底部找到一个地球形状的图标后，点击语言翻译，然后选择英语或普通话 Mandarin。如果您使用的是 iPad 或手机或类似设备，请找屏幕右上角的3点，点击语言翻译，然后选择英语或普通话 Mandarin。当您发言时，请放慢速度，让口译员能够同步翻译您所说的所有内容。谢谢。Thank you.
Thank you. We will now enable live transcription and interpretation. Please select your preferred language channel at this time. And just briefly to preview public comment, we will have 2 public comment periods today. The first will be a written comment period using the chat feature. We will enable the chat feature for public comment at that time. And then we'll end the meeting with public comment again by opening up the chat feature and inviting public comment. At that time, we will enable the virtual raise hand feature as well. All right, well, welcome to our meeting. I think I'm going to turn things over pretty immediately here to Janelle Kupinik. Janelle?
Thanks, Karen, and good to see everyone. We are getting to our home stretch here. And so I'm just going to be joining you briefly this morning, and I want to set the stage by talking about sort of a now what thing, which is, so as we get close to having our recommendations and coming forward with the specifics that we want to offer through the report, how do we start to think about implementation? This has come up throughout the conversation. So what happens? How do we get a system like this implemented? So I just want to present briefly a few thoughts that pertain to, what do we do next? How does this group put forward maybe some structures that you would like to see followed as we move forward? So if we can move to the next slide. And this is just, I think one of the important things to recognize in this work is this group has helped come up with a destination with regard to how do we move to a single rate structure for the system. And so that destination includes alternative methodology based on cost analysis. So we've spent, we started this process and really have honed in on how do we fix the broken market? How do we move from a price-based system to a cost-based system? So having that alternative methodology for which we now can see numbers coming out of the survey that are helping us construct some, reference or examples to consider. So first part of this is destination. Let's commit to something that includes this alternative methodology because it allows for looking at cost analysis. Let's build a single rate structure based on a base funding. So this again is something we've spent many meetings around. What constitutes the base? How do we look at that base? Then what are the various things that may adjust and help us construct for a single rate structure? And then finally, the recognition that we can construct something today, but if it's to keep up with costs or to be aligned to cost, we actually have to keep coming back to this and updating the model through continuous review so that it's not static in a moment where, and then we, align to cost in one moment, but then, in a couple of years from now, to keep that in place, we have to be continuously looking. So these are the things that are captured in the vision graphic that's been shared, and we'll come back to you in a moment. But in terms of destination, this gives us a place to start to organize forward, to say, if this is how we're going to move, how do we get there? So let's move to the next slide. And I just want to give you something to think about, which is, there was once a time, and I'm old enough to remember the triptychs, and I know many of us are headed out or have recently been on trips with our families or friends for summer vacation. And I remember, you pull out the map and you'd highlighter it and you'd look at it and you'd wonder which highways to go to or which roadways or how to avoid traffic. And you'd look at that map and you'd start to map it out. Well, many of us, I'm guilty of this. You get into the car and you pick up your phone and you type in the destination. You just trust this is going to take me to the right place. And if you're going to a major city, it usually works. If you're somewhere rural, you may end up at some funky road or dead end road. But generally, MapQuest, Google Maps, that's sort of our way, right? So we've really evolved in our understanding of how to get from A to B. So let's go to the next slide. And I think in this process, I have recognized in myself, there are things that I do in really different ways with regard to how I used to interact with paper maps and now what happens when I'm using a GPS-based system. With a paper map, you can't just pull and flick out the map while you're in the middle of the trip. You usually looked at it before, try to assess what was going to happen. If you made a wrong turn, you didn't just keep driving. You actually usually had to pull over because the maps were both so big and so small that you had to look it over. You could also, when you look at a paper map, see that you had several choices to get there. And then generally, it was helpful to have somebody as your navigator, somebody sit there and say, okay, right turn, left turn. In my case, it often results in a lot of screaming at each other, why aren't you telling me the right directions? Or that was too late, or, so there's all sorts of things that with paper map behaviors are very different than GPS, right? GPS, I get my phone and I enter it and I go. I wait for it to reroute me, and I'm kind of accepting that a couple times that might happen in the trip. And I'm just going to basically go where it tells me. I think about it and go, well, the phone is all I need. This is going to work. And the bottom line of both these kinds of maps, which is really, I think, where we're going as we think about how we're going to implement this, is they all get you to where you want to go, as well as they can get you lost, right? And some of this is, and I think even with these two systems, there's some need to kind of pause and think about things and organize for things. And I think that's been this work group's experience. It's hey, we're coming up with the places we want to go. We think we can put the destination in, now what? So let's go to the next slide. I'd actually like to propose to you that the work that you've done as a work group isn't handing over to the state or handing over to any entity the address or the map, but it's giving us a sense of what the topography looks like. And so, what we are doing as a group is we've actually looked at needs. We've assessed our data. We've engaged with stakeholders so that we can actually map the contours of the land. We know the issues, the values, the principles that are really important as we move forward. So we know where those hills, we know where those valleys, we know where those rivers lie. And now what you're putting forward is something that says, how do we get to our destination? So with this, I think it's not about necessarily just the address. It's actually about how we bring along a whole lot of stakeholders, a whole lot of interests. And then we have to ask ourselves, are we really going to climb the mountain? Is that like the way, or do we have to create some switchbacks because it's going to take us a little time to get everyone going that direction? Do we have to maybe go backwards to go forwards because there's a big boulder in our way? And I think that's the stuff that we know from past experiences takes a little bit of thought of how do you map out then, if you know the topography, how do you map out the steps? So let's move to the next slide. And let me just give you a few examples. And some of you in this group have experienced these examples. And there's many more that we could put, but I think this gives you some sense. So the first that I would put out there of how have we seen things like this be proposed as either getting done or being done. One I'd call out as the rate reform white paper. Right? There's some really clear recommendations recognizing that understanding the destination was one part of this, but then figuring out how you get there is another very important aspect of this. So, the rate reform white paper, right? What it said was, well, let's hold everyone harmless to start with. So no, this is not a redistribution formula where we start by taking away anything. What we're looking at is how do we build up? And so the second part of this, building up was, we're going to level up funding through a couple of mechanisms. One was to support alignment, right? So needing to look at how the age groups were aligned across program standards. The second was creating some new type of county level standard reimbursement rate. So introducing into one part of the system some structures that was building in some recognition of regional, and then using the regional market rates and building those up, leveling those up to what we were seeing in the standard reimbursement rate. So this was all about the steps, right? So it involves some structures being adopted and involves some readiness for the funds to come in. And then importantly, targets, right? So setting annual targets to then allocate those investments. So when funds became available, how do we move to the annual targets to close the gap between what was one rate structure to the other rate structure, and eventually bulling them up so that they came together. So what you see in this approach is one that is very much exhibited through how the K-12 system introduced the local control funding formula. Again, very similar in concept in that started with hold harmless. We're going to keep everyone where they are. The local control funding formula established targets for every single school district in the state. And then what the state did in this particular case of leveling up is they said, well, what we're going to do is close the gaps proportionally. So if the statewide was able to fund 20% of the gap in any given year, then any organization or agency's gap was closed by 20%. So it meant that it was different dollars, but same percent, okay? And then moving towards a uniform COLA that is provided to the whole system. So in all of these cases, what you see is it's about understanding what your target is. It's about creating mechanisms where in the time it takes to get this done, you're giving people some expectation of what they'll receive. You're preserving what they have, and you're showing them how it will grow. And in these two examples, there's a projection of a timeline to get there, but and in the case of the LCFF formula, it was originally said it would take about 9 to 10 years, and it took 7 to get to targets. So it's one of those things where you can get there faster when there's more. You can get there, it could take longer, but hopefully we're coming up with a practical approach that says we can get there as fast as we can, as well as we can, doing the things we need to be successful with this. So from the experiences that we've seen of complex systems changing and, bringing in new ways to fund, a couple of key lessons. One is avoid making it overly complex. If you need to have, treat this like rocket science, it's probably going to lose people on the way as you try to make this happen. And we have an inherently complex system. So coming up with some simplification of those steps is actually pretty hard. And so wanting to think generally like what's the rule we want to follow, and then how do we handle exceptions, opposed to what are all the exceptions, and then can we make a rule? Keep the math simple. So you can see in the example, both these examples, I want that to be, something that you can do with a multiplication and division, and get yourself there. And I think the other thing here is keeping focus on the goal and the target. So in both cases of the rate reform white paper, as well as the LCFF, there was a sense that they could quantify a target for where the rate should be. And this wasn't the first step of the process, but it was a step that had to be articulated. The last piece is, and I know this has come up in these conversations, is it has been a long journey to this moment. So how do we make sure we're getting the commitments we want to see so we have belief that the long-term will work? But that means the short-term provides for adequate investment to give evidence of like something significant happening. So in all of these things, you got to keep the short-term, like how do we get started so that we have a successful foundation to build on, with the long-term, which gets to how do we make sure it's sustainable. And those like good starts, sustainable futures is kind of the magic spot we're trying to think about as we think about how can we commit to some approach to phasing in to make sure that, again, eyes on target, people can come along and understand, and we can get to the result that we want to see. So I'm just going to share out very briefly, if we could go to the next slide, a consideration for you that I would like, this could be endless permutations of things, but I'm going to give you three really broad categories of level up options that we've seen as states have contemplated how to get new funding mechanisms in place. Okay, in this particular case, as we look at our recommendations, first off, let's not skip the immediate first step, which is really seeking federal permission to apply alternative methodology. Like that is the first step, right? So for any of these changes to be in place, that's I'd say is the first phase, getting permission so that we have approval to pursue the kind of work to work through the details. So presuming that we then get approval to work on the alternative methodology, one of the next steps would be to figure out what's the option that we're going to use to level up to our particular targets. So I think in all cases, what we've seen through this group and we've seen in past recommendations is this is again not being approach is a redistribution model. What you says, we're talking about a system that needs more everywhere. So let's start with, it's a hold harmless plus. So what's the plus? What that means is nobody gets less with than they have now, and they all should be seeing increases occurring based on some approach. Okay, so let me throw out three broad options here. The first is you say, okay, well, we'll give increases that are differentiating based on the distance to the targets. So I have this target, I'm going to just start to fund dollars to see that everyone gets something that closes the distance to the target. What that can look like is, let's say we all see a 5% increase or a 20% increase. You start to look at and say, those become then increases that apply to everyone. And over time, you will see that, we will close our gaps. It could be that you differentiate them based on the distance. So if you said, well, everyone that's 50% less than the target is going to get a higher level of increase than those that are 75% of the target. So you create some ways that you'd say a little bit more goes to those that are further away, but it's based on your current funded level. So, one of the pros of this kind of approach is you can get increases to everyone throughout the system. It would be just different amounts. It also, one of the cons is this could extend the time to get to targets because you're kind of incrementally closing for all, and depending on how much you have and how you do structure this, it will, and where your targets are lying, there's some time lags that can occur in this approach. The second is proportionally closing gaps on current funded levels. So this is very, I'll say, targeted universalism in approach. In fact, the first one can be too, if you look at that. So it's like what we talked about with targeted universalism is those furthest from opportunity receiving more. So by doing this, where you say, and I mentioned this is how LCFF, the local control funding formula worked, is the state funds a overall portion of the gap to target. And until that gap to target is fully formed, there'll be these increases that come that fund the agency gap to target, or unproportionally. So if the state funds 20% of the gap in a particular year, then those individuals and agencies see their gap close by 20% towards target. So what it does is those furthest from the gap, because they're getting 20%, the percentage, they see more dollars to see their gap closing. So this is one of the pros, is it's driven by equity, by addressing those furthest from opportunity through proportionality. The cons is those close to the target may experience small or no increases as we get closer to closing that gap, because this is all based on distance to gap, or distance the gap to the targets. The third area, and this is one that can build on some of the variables or the factors that we've talked about through this conversation, is, are there groups that you would prioritize and differentiate approaches to funding gaps? So examples could be creating categories for phasing, where you say, well, it's based on age, or it's based on area or region, or it's based on setting or program, or profile of child, or profile of workforce, so that there are components of things that get funded that create the reference to what is actually getting added. And the pro here is if you have agreement on what those priorities are, it allows for targeted increases. But without the agreement, this method may not support your equity goals. So in the past, I could say, when we've made choices to put more into infant care, that's an example of creating a priority and providing more funding. And so these are all three in a very, these are painted as different choices because they represent, I think, the range of things that you can do as you move through here. So I'm going to pause and see reactions, questions, ideas from this group. It would be wonderful if we could, I don't know that we'll reach a full agreement, but is there a leaning of this group towards a particular way based on what you believe we've been working through these many months of processing? So Robin.
Good morning. So a couple of questions. Are you proposing that we need to decide this today or by the October 15th? How does this play out? So the study that we're going to hear about, an update on the study is going to give us some numbers on what the true cost is. What I'm understanding, I think I'm understanding here, is you're presenting ways to phase in those numbers. And do we need to decide that now? So
yeah, great question, Robin. And I think what I'm putting forth is, does this group have a leaning in an area for which we could then put forward, further research investigation of how to apply this method? So are any of these completely off the table? Are any of these more attractive than others? Is there yet another way that you'd like to see reflected? But the end of this is, are we feeling prepared to put some reference to some ideas of how to do this into the report for as something that's been contemplated by the group?
Well, that's my question is, do we have to do this? Or can we just present the numbers?
I don't know. So the do we have to? I think this is getting to some of the practicalities of, it's not explicitly called for, but it does provide for some specificity of the next steps to investigate and to work through to support implementation. So is there something that, as we've talked about targeted universal, as we've talked about equity, as we've talked about child and workforce needs and outcomes, do any of these resonate more than the other? I think is what we're trying to test out here. So it's not to force any decisions, but I do think, it's also to confirm, like, is the first phase of this seem appropriate? Like, are we comfortable saying we're going to apply for alternative methodology? And then if so, what would we like to see done in preparation for some way of approaching, looking at the leveling of a rate? So I'm sort of dancing a little bit around the question, Robin, because I can't say definitively you have to, but I think it would certainly be helpful given, otherwise I think we have a loose thread from this work that's, without any kind of preference guidance from the group. So let me get to Dean and then Eric and then Robin, if you'd like to continue the line of thought. So Dean, then Eric, and then Robin again.
So Janelle, maybe it's just a clarifying question first. Is the idea with that idea of the level up options like priority categories, is that similar to what we currently have, where maybe there's additional funding if a child has special needs, a dual language learner, and then those are just samples? Is that
that's it, exactly. That's an example, Dean. I mean, I think we've applied that method to past practice without the target, but you could imagine doing that with the targets, some targets in mind, and saying we're going to do these groups first, or this need first, or this area. So yes, that's a good clarification. So Eric, then Robin, then Donna.
So I appreciate what Robin has brought to the table this morning. I think it's important that we probably come to consensus on this. However, I think I would like more input from the group and more discussion from everybody who's listening, the participants in the field. So I would like a little bit more input from everybody, and I don't think we have to decide today, but I do think it is something that we have to probably at least come to a consensus on before we're finished. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Eric. Okay, Robin, back to you, and then Donna.
Thank you. So now that I understand it, I would vote for not presenting how the state is going to fund what we come up with as the true cost. I believe that our charge is to come up with the true cost and not help the state fund it. The state has the money. Let them come back to us and say how they think they can fund it. I don't think it needs to be phased in. There is the funding for that. So I would vote to not give them options on how to lowball us.
Okay, I see Donna nodding. Donna, do you want to add anything to that?
I agree with Robin. I think that all of these approaches give us the opportunity to undercut ourselves. And this whole industry is so starved, and I don't want to be in a position of deciding winners and losers in this. I think that we need to move together. The minute you start dividing off who's winning and who's losing, the thing will fall apart at the field level. And part of what we talked about in the work group was that we needed to lift all boats. And I really worry about getting divided up by doing this. And the other thing, I am struck that I probably have said this to many people on this call.
there are a lot of attempts to make this really complicated. It's not that complicated. It's just expensive. And I keep coming back to the fact that we need to be real about how expensive it really is and own it. And the state needs to step up and figure out how they're going to get to the real cost of this so that we have a viable system moving forward. I spoke to multiple people yesterday about no one wants to come into this field. This is not a viable career for young people. And if we don't start to do this, it's not going to survive. So I kind of lean with Robin. The other thing, as far as phasing in principles and options, I want to make sure we don't lose in the alternative methodology the fact that we need to correct the state's policy in our state plan that we don't limit what the state pays by what parents can afford. I think in a prior meeting, we discovered that it is part of our state plan, and that's not what happens in other states, and that the state subsidy dollars could be used to enhance and build up the system and not be limited by what fee-paying parents who are struggling to pay the cost of care can afford. So I want to make sure that that doesn't get lost in this process.
Okay, so thanks, Donna. I think what's surfacing is a sense that we can establish what's needed, that I think the comment of all boats rising, and I don't mean to suggest that there's any of these methods are not about all boats rising. The question is, you have some that are riding a little lower in the water right now. So how do you start to think about them? And so is it just raising the water level, or is it actually lightening the load for some of them? So it's, I'm not trying to suggest that this is about taking winners or losers. In fact, I think if you look at most of these, it's about how, if you have to take some steps. I mean, sometimes it's not just the money that's the step. It's the capacity of the system. It's the readiness of the standards. It's like lots of pieces that I think we found over time that we got to get staged so we can be successful in doing things. So it's just, also I put that out there is, what is it that we're looking at outside of just some of the variables of where the money goes, but are we really ready with all the structures and systems that we've also talked about having in place with regard to policy and capacity? So Eric, your comment.
For presenting all this and being the messenger of this topic. But I really wanted to amplify what Donna mentioned. We keep talking about the cost of care and the state having to step up to pay for it. Conversely, we kind of danced around how this impacts the private pay world. And what Donna mentioned about the rule in our state plan about the broken system still regulating the cost of care, regardless of what the survey says, that I think should be a work group recommendation, that we remove that portion from our state plan, because that's a functional failure in our current state system. That's a self-inflicted wound that has driven the cost of care, or the amount of, as you say, the ability for parents and for the subsidy system to move forward. And that's the only way that we can make sure that high tide raises all boats, not just on the subsidized side, but we do not drown the private pay world and put them out of business as well. So I think that's an important thing that needs to be highlighted, and I think that should be a recommendation from this group, is to remove that provision, because that's a structural problem. And that's one of the charges of this work group. Regarding phasing principles and options, I know policymakers have a lot of tools in their toolbox. And wanting to make sure that high tide raises all boats, and some, yes, are a little bit lower in the water than others, using that reference. So my opinion would be, of the three that you've presented, we do not go near the differentiated increase one. That one seems the most dangerous of the three presented. At least in my opinion. I do want to say that the system is woefully underfunded. The legislature does have to step up And Donna is absolutely correct. It's not complicated, it's just expensive. And if the goal or the priority, I should say, instead of the goal, I think we should change the word to priority. So what is the priority of the state and how important is this priority in the midst of all the other priorities the state has? Thank you.
Other feedback, input from workgroup members? I also just want to, while it may be self-evident, I think for the purposes of affirmation, just don't want to overlook that number one at the top of this slide, the seeking federal permission to apply alternative methodology. Just want to, while it may be minor, maybe even just putting in the chat affirmation that is indeed the recommendation of this work group. But other input as well. Robin, please go ahead.
So I would really love to hear from the other work group members as to whether or not this group wants to recommend any options on how the state can fund what we're about to recommend. I personally vote for not having options presented to them. I just want to present what the true cost is. And so how do we get to, in this work group, that decision today of are we going to have options or not have options? And then do we all vote? I think there's 10 of us, maybe 11 of us. Like, what do we do? I don't want to have this conversation and then maybe see some changes to this chart when we haven't decided if we want this chart.
Well, so I think at the very least, Robin, what I'm hearing you say is a solicitation of your fellow workgroup members on more input around whether this work group even wants to offer options, an option or put forth the nature, the notion of phasing in options, right? So I think we could certainly take a few more minutes around that. And I don't think it needs to be decided today. And Janelle or Carla, please speak up if that's the case, but certainly getting a sense from the room where people are leaning and being really open with alternative viewpoints on this, right? So that each work group member can feel informed about this. With that, Virginia, please go ahead.
Thanks so much. Can you hear me okay? I have big noise next to me.
Yes.
Perfect. So in listening to this conversation, I know that this puts many of the members of the work group in a really tough position because, everyone wants to see the numbers and know, okay, how would each option affect them and their reimbursement, especially since we have directors as members of the work group. And so I wonder, and sort of acknowledging that puts many work group members in a really tough spot without seeing more of the details and wanting to not be divided and to think system-wide. I'm wondering if there's work we can do to make sure that the pros and cons here are fully laid out so that, if we were to give sort of these as decision points to the legislature, for example, that there would be field perspective outline, okay, here are the benefits of this one, here are the downsides of this one, here are the benefits of this one, here are the downsides of this one. So sort of building that piece out more, understanding that it may be hard to come to consensus on these different ones, but maybe we can make sure that whoever ends up having to make the decision has the nuance and the understanding of how they impact as that is informed by folks that are operating the programs.
Thanks, Virginia. Appreciate that suggestion. And again, so folding that into the discussion and contemplation today. So a suggestion to at least fully flesh these out so that I'm hearing whether this work group recommends a phase-in option or not, we are educating the legislature in this report around the consequences and trade-offs of these different options. I think, Virginia, if I'm hearing you right, that may be in the best interest of the process. Any other input right now? And again, so just to reiterate this, I mean, as you can tell, this isn't a today decision. Wanted to have you begin contemplating these things. We can come back to this. We don't need to introduce this in the report. This can really just be fundamentally, recommending the cost of care model. So,
Donna. Sorry, I didn't raise my hand.
Real hand, that's fine.
I do think that the legislature has some difficult decisions to make over the next 5 years about where they're going to put money. I think that our strongest position is to put out what it should be. And then there's going to have to be an incremental process to get there. There are models that have been used in the past. You lifted up LCFF, where there was a target and a timeline to get to the goal, rather than bits and pieces and undercutting. I think that those would be very different. I'm struggling with making sure we don't lead with the incrementalism and we lead with this is what it costs.
Thank you, Donna. I appreciate that. And Janelle, I know you need to go, so we should let you go now. And thank you so much. We'll catch you up on what's talked about later today. I see Lily's hand. Carla, did you want to jump in any kind of way before I let Lily go? No, okay. Lily, please go ahead.
Good morning. I also agree that we should present the data as it should be and how underfunded this sector is. Also, maybe providing alternative funding methods. I don't know if that's possible. With some hopefully researching best practices, because there's some states that actually I'm sure have good numbers and have good programs, and we just probably don't know what they are. So if we can look for those best practices and maybe highlight them as possible solutions, maybe that's an alternative that can help this process.
Thanks, Lily. And I think as we dive more into the cost model with P5 fiscal strategies, that's sort of in alignment with that as well in terms of alternative methodology. Carla, I see your hand, and then Jackie.
Yeah, I wanted to echo Donna's comment on leading with the goal and the importance of that. So I think this work group back in January or February talked about the principles and the importance of phases and what phases will mean. So while maybe not using the terminology in the chart here of leveling up, but thinking about what phases are needed. And I wonder if we could offer, we have one-on-one work group member meetings with Nancy Stroll in the upcoming weeks. And if this is a question that's posed to all work group members and seeing what phases would make sense. And then being very, very clear in the report that the goal is the cost that this group has been debating for the last few months and the cost model. But for offering solutions, it seems like it's the first time that we're struggling with this question. So those one-on-ones could be helpful.
Thanks, Carla. Jackie, what are your thoughts?
Oh, I have so many, and many of my colleagues have already reiterated a lot of it. And I agree that we need to lead with a cost model. And I appreciate you putting this on the table for us, food to thought, but there is definitely, I'm feeling some sort of way about it. I'll just be honest. And that we should actually lead with the cost of doing business. If we're using the LCFF model, I'm going to tell you right now, there are problems with rolling that out anyways, because the cost of doing business increases every single year. And so I'm not sure if we should use LCFF as the model, because many school districts would tell you that they still, even though they have met the target, it's still not sufficient to fill the need. So if you are going to have that framing, I'll just be honest right now that many districts will tell you that it's still not sufficient given kind of other costs. So I lean towards leading with the cost model as we proposed. and then going from there.
Thank you, Jackie. Horace, what are your thoughts on this?
Appreciate it as it has been brought to our attention, but I have to agree to give my opinion. Robin, Donna, we should lead and understand that the industry is so far underfunded and needs to be brought up to reality. And this is going to show that. We have to really put pressure on legislators as well as the state to make this happen for us. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So I think we're hearing the sort of the coalescence around the work group's leanings here. And Carla, do you feel like at this point, forgive me, just looking to you with Janelle having to leave, if there's anything else you want to speak to here or ask about as it relates to this?
This is perfect. See that, yes, move forward with the alternative methodology was really clear from the comments, and then lead with a cost model, and then there will be some follow-up discussions with folks, but definitely not differentiated increases, and proportionality was taken out as well. So we will not use this in the report. Thank you, Karen.
Thank you, Carla. Well summarized. Thank you. Okay, so we are now going to open the chat feature, and we'll be leaving that open for 5 minutes for the initial public comment period to provide written public comment for the public record. So we welcome attendees to do so now. Forgive me, the lawnmower is right outside. And while we keep that chat feature open for 5 minutes, we will continue on with the meeting. And I think we're now going to switch gears around more about the report. And I think I'm going to be turning it over to you, Carla.
Hello, everyone. So very, very thrilled to share that folks received a comprehensive report. We've come a long way, and goals for the report that you received are one, to make it as simple as possible based on the recommendations that you've shared. Work group members received the report itself that gives the recommendations. And then the second piece are some the appendices that we need in order to bolster some of the information that's been shared here. So we wanted to give a quick overview of the report, some of the recommendations, and then we'll spend some time on family, friend, and neighbor, because that was a placeholder in the report. So we want to make sure to address those issues. So first and foremost, the report really clearly lays out the charge of the work group. As a reminder, under AB 131, we call out a single rate structure. And the work that we are doing in partnership with the Rate and Quality JLMC is making sure that there is a focus on the single rate structure. As we look at that for the work group in particular, there's a call out in the statute for assessing the methodology for establishing the reimbursement rates. And what this work group has said really clearly is the regional market rate survey is not working. So let's assess other methodologies, and P5 fiscal strategies has been one of the lead researchers that has offered information about what other states have done. So call of the statute. There's also information regarding aligning with Head Start and making sure that we're looking at workforce competencies. So we'll look into this in the recommendation. So if we go to next slide. This has been our working framework. It has evolved. It started as a PowerPoint that many of you shared back in February. That is not going to work. We need to make major changes to it. There's been one-on-one conversations with work group members. There has been conversations here, and this is what it has evolved into. This might also end up, we may change some of the style of this, but this is what we've discussed thus far. So as a reminder, the rate and quality vision is what's called out in the statute in AB 131. The values came right out of statute as well: equity, quality, children and families, and accessibility. Early educators was not something that was called out in the statute specifically, but this work group thought it was really important to add that to the values, so made those changes. The guiding principles are the philosophy that will drive decision-making as we make the recommendations that you all have shared throughout the months. Going through these were really important discussions for the work group in regards to respect for the field, in regards to equity, looking at region differentiation. So this really captures the discussions that ultimately led to recommendations. And this is where we want to spend some time. The recommendations you see here have been divided into 3 different sections. The first is the charge of the group, that methodology, and this work group was really, really clear. We want to focus on the cost of care, and we want to focus on the base and making sure that the base actually allows for making sure that there's quality in that sort of phase 1, making sure that we're looking at variables that we had a lot of discussion that are important to include in the base. So, and under 1, the charge of the group has been really clear that there is a recommendation for moving to an alternative methodology that uses a cost analysis. And that's been a lot of our discussions with P5 fiscal strategies. So that is the most important recommendation that this work group has called out. It's pretty major system change. So we added that first. The second piece of the recommendations are, in order for the single rate structure and the alternative methodology to work in the state of California, there are recommendations that support that. So that includes sustainable funding source. And we heard that again today as you all were discussing the different phases. We had a lot of conversations about the intersection of equity, quality, what it means for child outcomes, and discussions about workforce well-being and how we make sure that there is support for early care and educators, irrelevant of what setting they're in. And then there's placeholders right now for alignment to tribal programs and Head Start, again, looking at some of the charge of the statute. And then number 3, this will be additional conversations as there is one-on-one discussions with the workgroup members. These are recommendations beyond August 2022. So as a reminder, this work decided back in February that the workforce competencies should be discussed later after the base and the cost model have been defined, and making sure that that is a continued conversation. Second, continuous evaluation of the implementation of the single rate structure and alternative methodology. Many of you have lifted up the importance of transparency, making sure that the data exists somewhere publicly, and then how will it be evaluated? And then lastly, there has been a discussion of targeted universalism, making sure that as we talk about phases, we look at what strategies might exist in regards to serving families furthest from opportunity, but there is not an implementation plan in these recommendations. So the work group has proposed having these conversations afterwards. The question that remains for number 3 is, will this work group take the charge of having some of those conversations, or will there be other or will there be recommendations that those conversations happen elsewhere? Those will be the questions that are asked of you during one-on-one. What sort of recommendation would you make for this? And I'll add, this is a working visual, so there are bullet points missing here: quality, phase 2. The assessment of that is missing within this, but we're trying to update this to fit in a lot of the information in one page. So please take a look at your comprehensive report, because that will have the full beyond August 2022 recommendations. So that's an overview of the report, what you all are getting. In regards to timeline, all of you received the comprehensive report, and we're asking that workgroup members submit any comments by July 20th this year in order for them to be incorporated into the next report, so that you all have one last final report to take a look at. And then for the public, we've shared this publicly, and we'll be taking public comments until July 18th. And the hope is to share some of those with the workgroup members. So that's an overview of this. Let me pause there and see if there's any questions.
I see Robin has a hand up. Robin, go ahead.
I paused to give other people turn. So on that visual, is this an opportunity to provide suggested edits and have a conversation about that? Or are you saying wait for our one-on-one meeting? Because I do have suggestions that I think, I have suggestions.
Yeah, and Robin, if you look at the comprehensive report, and they're missing there, so it's been added to the comprehensive report, but we got suggestions and feedbacks at a staggered time. So the visual itself doesn't have all the information from the comprehensive report. Once we see the comprehensive report, the visual is totally going to be updated, but wanted to use the same visual we've been using thus far so that folks know it's the same one. So it would be most helpful if you don't see them in the comprehensive report to get information there, because it's included, Robin, at least the comments you gave.
And so the report is where? The draft report?
You should have received it via email, but we'll send it again to everyone so that it's top of email after this meeting.
And it looks like our WestEd team also posted a link just now in the chat as well. Anything else before we move on to family, friend, and neighbor? Okay, well, let me get my screen back up here. And so, Carla, is there anything you'd like to say before we hand this off to Donna and Eric Peterson?
So the work group asked for some data regarding California's family, friend, and neighbors. So let's share a little bit of this, and then Donna and Eric P are going to give an overview of just the work they do with family, friend, and neighbors. But basically, this is a placeholder in the report. The work group was really clear that family, friend, and neighbors should be part of the base discussions. And then questions came up as to what does the family, friend, and neighbor workforce look like in the state of California. So we'll share that quick overview. And then Donna and Eric have experience in working with the family, friend, and neighbor population. So we thought it would be really helpful to hear from work group members on what should this look like, any recommendations as we think about finalizing that placeholder in the report. So let's share some of those data points, and this will be really short, but again, just addressing some of the questions that have come up. So California has nearly 19,500 family, friend, and neighbors in all the counties except one. So 57 counties have family, friend, and neighbors. As you see in the map, Los Angeles has the highest number of family, friend, and neighbor providers, about 8,800. and nearly 5,000 of family, friend, and neighbors have been serving children for over 7 years. So this is a population that ends up staying really stable. There's about 5,000 that have been serving children for less than 1 year. A majority of family, friend, and neighbors report that they speak English, but we think there's more unpacking of that report that needs to happen in order to see, is it really reporting the language that's spoken or language to respond to the inquiries. Next slide, please. Continuing to give a and then a significant number in rural and suburbs in order to serve young children. About 77% of family, friend, and neighbors are providers that provide childcare services to relatives outside the child's home. And then the next major number is relatives outside the child's home by a non-relative. Next slide, please. And then just who do family, friend, and neighbors serve in the state of California? The first colorful chart you see, over half of the families served by family, friend, and neighbors are Latinx and Black families. And the families served are living significantly below the poverty rates of California. So the chart you see at the bottom shows you just the monthly income of the families that are served. And the big takeaway is that these families are even below what we call a poverty line in California. And then the last data point, next slide, please. Just diving deeper into who are the children served by family, friend, and neighbors. There's about 37,000 children served by family, friend, and neighbors throughout the state. And the chart to your far right gives you an overview of the age group of the children served. The largest age group was 6 and over. That ends up being about 18,000 children being served that are 6 and older. So slightly on the higher age range. So we wanted to give you this quick overview on who the population is serving, and then to get a better sense of what sort of recommendations the work group has in regards to family, friend, and neighbors, because there was some decision points on the whether or not it's minimum wage that we consider here or something else. What do we consider for quality standards? And these are not decision points that need to be made, but rather want to make sure that we have the input of the work group as we finalize that section in the report. So with that, we would love to turn it over to the true experts of folks that have been doing this work and have worked with family, friend, and neighbors for some years. So let's start with Donna, some of your input and thoughts on how to think about this in the report.
Thank you, Carla. And I always kind of shudder when I get called an expert on anything, because I know I always have things to learn from everyone else. But I did want to start off just with giving some context to family, friend, and neighbor care. First and foremost, if you're a parent, you've probably used it. And we all use informal care to manage our lives and take care of our children. And whether that's a grandparent or an aunt or uncle or a friend or a neighbor, often our lives require that we have to bring other people in to help us manage our schedule and the demands of our lives. So I just want to have a little level setting that this is just a reality for all, most parents, if not all, that at some point or another, you have to have some help. The second piece is I want to clarify how this group is really defined in our state subsidy system has to do with our licensing rules. So in the state of California, it is legal to take care of children from one additional family to your own. It's not based on the number of kids, it's based on family. So anyone can care for another family's children without having to get a license. And that is the group that largely falls into our state subsidy system. These are family, friend, and neighbor providers who step up to fill the gaps and really provide a critical service to our state, to our families, and certainly to our children. In my experience, there are a lot of reasons families choose family, friend, and neighbor care. Some have to do with the fact that the child may have an existing relationship. You notice there were a lot of very, very young children who are cared for by family, friend, and neighbor providers. I think all of us who have spent our lives working on early childhood development understand that attachment and belongingness and security are a huge component for quality of experience for a child. And I think that many parents embrace this because it's an opportunity for their child to be with someone they know and they feel safe with. And it is a valid choice. It is a choice that's applauded in some communities, and unfortunately in our state subsidized system has been maligned and frowned upon for as long as I've been involved. So I really think we need a paradigm shift around that. Another reason that family, friend, and neighbor providers get used is they fill in a lot of the gaps. We have a lot of families who work non-traditional hours. They work rotating schedules. They may go to school and work, and often they are the secondary provider. They're the provider who picks the child up from school. They're the provider who will take care of a child during school non-operational days. They will take a child over the weekend. They will take a child overnight. And they really provide the opportunity for parents, particularly parents who are in the service industry and are typically pretty low income, to be able to go to work and do their jobs. So they do fill a critical need for families. They also fill the gaps where our system fails. And I couldn't help but notice that Lancaster and Palmdale, which are two areas where CCRC provides services, had very high numbers of license exempt providers. Well, we have very little licensed care. And when you have limited amounts of licensed care, parents have to find alternate solutions. And often that is the choice that they make. So what I really am hoping that we all take away from this is that this is part of the continuum of service in our state. This is part of how we care for our children. And we need to ensure that we are compensating them in a respectable manner. Currently, we pay a reimbursement rate that is a percentage of a family childcare rate. And prior to last year, it was a formula derived even lower than just a flat percentage. One of the changes in last year's budget changed what we pay providers to be 70% of the family childcare rate. Prior to that, we were paying some of these exempt providers as low as $3 per child. And I can't tell you how many testimonies I've given in the state legislature where I have said I bought a cup of coffee at Starbucks this morning and spent more than we're paying per hour to care for a baby. And that's shameful, and we can't continue that way. So the good news is we're now paying 70%, so we're up to maybe $7 an hour, still half of minimum wage. So we have a long way to go, and we have to handle these providers slightly differently. They are not running a business. This is them caring for another child or children in a family that they have a relationship with. But we need to ensure that we're paying them a reasonable, respectable amount of money to do this very important work, and that we value them as part of our system. So I'll pass it off to Eric to see what else he wants to add.
Thank you, Donna. I like when you go first because then I can just fill in the blanks. Great job. So ditto Donna. Again, coming from a more largely urban area, language, culture, and infant care is very important need for our parents, just like all of you. I mean, if we had a society that valued this, we would allow, I'm sure that everybody on this call would prefer to stay home with their infant the first year or two. I'm sure that would be the preference, but we can't do that. So with that being said, a lot of our parents prefer friends and family care, including most of the people on this call, I'm assuming. Donna hit the hours thing. 60% of our care in Alameda County is exempt care. 60% of our parents use evening and afternoon off hours care. It matches right up. So also the availability of infant and school age care, which is another area that you saw in those charts, is lacking in a lot of our areas, urban and rural. So there's not a lot of infant care to choose from. There's not a lot of after school care to choose from. If a provider has a choice of keeping a full-time child in care and then a part-time after school one, they're going to choose the full-time one. Therefore, where you get a lot of exempt child care. Also, Eric put a thing up in there about the rates, and I would like to say, and I've been saying this for 30 years now, if you're a parent that's hiring somebody to come into your house, you're paying a lot of money in the open market, 20, 30 bucks an hour. And so I just want to recognize that the real cost of exempt friends, family, and neighbor care for real people is very expensive. And so just throwing that out there. And you know what Donna said about us, we used to pay $3 an hour. Well, what happened with a lot of our families that used part-time after school care is their family fee was more than their $3 an hour. We didn't even end up paying the child care provider at all. I just wanted to throw that out there. Let's see.
And I'll hop in, Eric, and answer Sure. Robin's question in the chat that the definition of family in the state subsidized system is grandparent, aunt, or uncle.
That's correct.
And everyone else has to have a trust line background check, even if they're a cousin or, you know, anyone who's not that immediate family structure has to have a background clearance. So the family definition is grandparent, aunt, or uncle.
And the vast majority of our exempt providers are family members. Also, something about the ages in our subsidy programs. In our alternative payment subsidy programs, a lot of our parents have been on for a long time. Therefore, there's a lot of school age care and not a lot of infant care. They've just been around for a long time. And as new people come on the program with babies, that's where you'll see the infants. And very occasionally, our parents have babies. I mean, the average number of children that we have in our alternative payment programs is 1.6 children per family that we're paying. And that's stayed the same since 1992 when I started. So there's a myth out there that there's a lot of children. That's just not true. It's been less than 2 since 1992 that we're paying for. I did want to bring up one other thing that is important to this work group, and that is California is currently out of compliance with the federal CCDBG standards for exempt child care providers. We're currently breaking the law. So there's a number of things that are required by CCDBG funding around training hours and health and safety requirements for our exempt child care providers. And I'm not going to speak for CDSS, but I'm sure that they're working on ways to remedy that. It's going to be costly. It's going to be difficult because of the amount of exempt child care providers. And it's going to cost our exempt child care providers and agencies money to administer that. So as part of this work group, I just want to make sure that we build in a framework where we'll support full compliance with the federal requirements. So I just want to throw that out there because I know that's a really deep in the weeds thing, but those of us who are running programs know that that's coming and we're going to have to pay for it. So yeah, that's pretty much it. I think I hit everything. So I guess we can take some questions. I'm not sure how this works. Sorry, Carla, I'll let you take over.
Well, I'm happy just to jump in and invite any questions that the work group may have around family, friend, neighbor, and sort of thinking about, you know, your charge as a work group in the report as well. Any questions you have for Donna or Eric? Yeah, Jackie.
I don't know if it's a question, more of a comment. As you know, for impact, we've actually strategically invested in family, friend, and neighbor, and those who are not state funded. And I would say I just kind of break the mythology that FFNs are not quality, because they have fully engaged in our work. And so I just wanted to highlight, and we have research about the progress made there. And so as we think about cost modeling and the rates, they definitely are part of this larger ecosystem. And Donna, I know you put it in the chat, but I also was I chose FFN for my baby up to 2 years old, for at least one of them. And I also have sat on a CDC board that had infant care and just not space for my kid. So I think it's each of my children were different. And so I think that to empower families to make the choice that is right for them, I would say that there are things that are offered in my FFN kind of space, like language development, quite frankly, and multilingual learning for my own child. And so there are just a lot of benefits of FFNs, and we should actually, again, acknowledge that, break the mythology that FFNs do not provide quality care.
And thank you, Jackie. And I would just add, there have been efforts in the past in California to do more training and support for family, friend, and neighbor providers. I think what, in my experience, has been most successful is efforts that are similar to parents and really approaching this population with support and information and resources. Has worked best. We actually, as part of our preschool development grant, did a cafe model that we have tested this past year with family, friend, and neighbor providers, bringing a group of them together to talk about caring for children, talk about some of the basics of child development. And what we find is largely the family, friend, and neighbor providers are really eager to learn more, that they really are interested in providing an enriching environment for the children they're caring for, because they're invested in these children. These children often are part of their own family. So we really have seen that to be a successful model. The other thing I do want to lift up before I toss it back to Carla is we also have done some work in Los Angeles County identifying family, friend, and neighbor providers who might want to be licensed providers. We find that this is a group of people who have self-identified as interested in caring for another child, and that often they might be a good candidate to work with through our Child Care Initiative project and through our apprenticeship programs to move them to becoming a licensed family child care provider so they can broaden the service that they're offering past their own family. For many, that's not the case. Many of them, they are, family member, and they just want to help the family member out that they're working with. But we have had some success in recruiting these folks into the child care licensing system.
I'd add just 3 quick things that Donna just ticked in my memory. One is we do have play groups for friends, family, and neighbor care here at Bananas, where we get them together, because one of the things they're hungry for is exposure to other adults and ideas and being able to interact with other children. And so we're providing that. 2 is they're very hungry for resources, and it's very difficult to go find curriculum as an exempt child care provider. So we had a project, which I'm hoping we can do again, where we gave out backpacks to every time we did an intake with an exempt provider with age-appropriate curriculum. And then we sent them a new one when it switched. And the third thing that I would say is what I've noticed in the decades of doing this is when parents come in new to subsidy, they'll typically have an exempt provider, but as they move more into the preschool ages, they want their children in a environment like 3 and 4-year-olds. And so they move out of exempt care into preschool to get their children ready to school all by themselves, basically, because they want to do that. So I just wanted to throw those 3 things out there.
Thank you, Eric. Thank you, Donna. Really appreciate that overview for us and the sort of the personal perspective from it. Deborah, I see your hand, and then we'll take a break and come back with P5. So Deborah, please go ahead.
Oh, thank you. Good morning, everyone. It's been a busy morning for me. So getting a little quiet and listening. But I thank you, Don and Eric, for that. I appreciate it. So when I think of family, friends, and neighbors, what comes to mind and why I'm listening is that there are a lot of providers in-home licensed providers, in-home based educators who are willing to work those weekend hours, who are willing to work those non-traditional hours, and who are doing that. But they find themselves sometimes up against this wall of competing with, I'll be frank with you, with their R&Rs. Because they'll turn around and they'll say, I have space, but I haven't got a call for my R&R in years. That is a conversation for providers right now in this state. That should not be happening, but it is happening. This is a part of our reality that's out there. Carla, when you put those numbers up and you spoke about the FFNs that are majority of minorities, bottom line is Hispanics and Blacks. And I was looking at these numbers and I'm saying to myself as you're speaking, is this why the state distanced themselves for so many years? And now the state is saying, welcome in, come, we want to be concerned now. These providers have been out there for a long time and nobody cared. But the union cares the entire time for these people. Not these people, but for providers, they're just like me. I am a family daycare provider. When any parent who calls me or knocks at my door, I am a stranger to them. And I have a sign that says, you enter as a stranger, but you leave as a friend, because that's real to me. So with family, friends, and neighbors, it's not just about, if I can say, again, Carla's numbers, it was low income. Those are the same parents that in-home based providers are caring for. The exact same parents, the same community that we're all caring for. So I don't want to talk about family, friends, and neighbors, in all honesty, as if it's a complete separate group or a separate group of people over here. We're lumped together. We're lumped together. How do we take that particular field and continue to include them and show them what we've been showing them? The state has to step up. And that's all. I was listening to these numbers, listening to everyone speak, but yet I'm thinking these are the same people, family daycare providers are serving out there. The exact same families, the same community. So let's not make it sound so separate. I'm sorry. That's just how I'm feeling right now. So I appreciate everything, believe me, that everyone's doing. But thank you. Let's take that break, sister. Thank you.
Thank you, Deborah. Always appreciate your perspective. Yeah, let's take a break. Let's do that. Let's take a 10-minute break, be back at 10:06 promptly, because as always, we're asking P5 to sort of squeeze in a lot in limited time. So we will see you at 10:06. Thank you.
David, this is Mari, if you're still on.
Madi, are you trying to get to David Bruchel?
Yes, I'm not able to access the box link to access the recording from the last meeting.
Okay.
So I'm just trying to follow up with him on how to get access to that.
Okay, I'm happy to send the two of you an email just to make sure you're connected and can get help with that.
Okay, thanks so much.
You, okay. Okay, it's 10:06. Thanks for coming back. Thanks so much for putting your cameras on if you can, so we know you are back with us. We would like to turn things over to our colleagues at P5 Fiscal Strategies. So if you would flash your cameras just to let us know you're here. And we will turn things over to Gina and team.
Hey everyone, great to see you this week. So we are going to jump in with a little bit more review of outputs from the cost model, in particular responding to things that you raised during our discussion last week and bringing you that additional detail. So the primary thing we're going to be looking at is the comparison of cost per child information from the cost model to the available revenues for the given scenario. So we're going to do a little bit of a high-level walkthrough of the different inputs into the model before we start looking at those scenarios. So I am going to share a slide deck that we'll also make sure that you get access to after the meeting, so you can look at the numbers yourself. Sorry, my apologies. My computer shut down right at the break, threw me off Zoom and closed every single file and thing that I had open. So luckily it was a break. I was able to get back on and be back in time to come back. %. As we always do, we just remind everyone that this work is supported by private funding in support of or in work partnership with the Rate and Quality Workgroup and the JLMC. So nothing new there. And then what we wanted to just to remind, so that anyone that maybe this is their sort of first time unpacking the outputs of the cost per child from the cost model, if you weren't with us with the last meeting, some of the basics of how the model functions. So as we've always talked about, the model is at a minimum foundation is the cost related to a legally operating program in the state of California. We are talking about programs serving children from birth to school age in full day, full year settings. So we are not at this stage looking at outputs on serving, say, only a part day preschool age child for 2.5 hours or 3 hours a day. We are looking at the idea of full day, full year, and care that meets the needs of working families. The model does allow for the option of understanding the cost related to non-traditional hours of care, so FFN and family childcare settings that provide care overnight or on the weekends. We did not run those scenarios for today, but always want to remind you that the model does allow for that functionality when we talk through other scenarios that we run. As part of thinking about that idea of a legally operated program, it does include all of the mandatory employer taxes and coverage for breaks as far as how the staffing pattern is developed and how we think about the total costs related to the positions that are in the scenarios. And that's in the case of all the types of scenarios, center-based, family childcare, and FFN. And then it also includes the expenses related to meeting health and safety standards under licensing or meeting licensing is another foundation of how it functions. We are going to look at the non-personnel values today for both centers and family childcares, but I also think it's important that we have that quick reminder that we spend most of our time really talking about position costs like salary or wages and discretionary benefits for salary and wages. But the model does include all of the costs of operating a childcare program in whichever type of program you are, center, family childcare, FFN, which of course includes non-personnel expenses. And the types of things that we refer to as non-personnel are not related to paying the individuals that are providing the care to the children or the director or the assistant director, but it's the other things, the supplies, mortgage or rent, utilities related to keeping the home or facility running, all nutrition costs related to serving children, transportation is built in there. So anything outside of actually paying the people that are caring for children in the childcare program is included in that non-personnel. And you may remember from the survey and early days of talking about the non-personnel variables, there's at least 36 different categories of non-personnel expenses that were captured and organized into these big buckets. And we also allowed for folks to write in. So if by chance we hadn't in those 36 line items, there was something else that wasn't included, we always are willing to take more information on non-personnel expenses. And that is a core part of how the model functions. The next piece of how the model functions is related to the variables. And these became really important as we were having that conversation around what is the base, and understanding the idea of having certain variables be built into the base and think about what those variables would be. We actually have a slide where we're going to unpack this a little more, but I just wanted to offer as a reminder that we talked through all of these different concepts and then ultimately made decision around what were the value that would be in the model or the dollar amount that would be in the model for the different variables. And we're going to look at a slide and see how that value differs for a Title 22 program meeting base quality and a Title 5 program meeting base quality. But this is a reminder of those variables, because that's another, there's the core model functioning, and then you make these selections of the variables. All of the variables, with the exception of inclusion supports and dual language learner, are turned on in the base scenarios that we're running and what we're looking at today. So the one thing that we talked about last week, and we thought it would be helpful to share more detail on, is the idea of how the state was organized into regions. What we talked about is that the workforce study that was done by the Berkeley Center on the study of childcare employment organize the state into regions. This map is actually from Berkeley's work and organizing and thinking about the childcare workforce in California. We followed these regions as how we organized the outputs from the model, as well as organized the expense information that came in, the revenue information that came in. We followed these regions. We thought it was helpful for folks to actually see the regions. This is not new, but last week when we met, you saw charts with the region at the top of the chart. Now you're actually looking at the map. You see that. So we have two southern regions. One is Los Angeles, and then the other is the dark navy counties. So you just kind of can understand how the state is divided up into those 5 regions. So it gives you a little bit more context. And so, yes, Teresa. Okay. You can get off the chair so that she doesn't fall behind me while I'm doing this with you all this morning. So what we want to move on to now is giving you a little bit more context on the cost model. That we're looking at are all using MIT Living Wage Calculator as the selection for salaries and running all the cost per child information using those. We talked about this last week, but we thought it more a repeat and making sure that folks had questions on how we use the Living Wage Calculator and how we also then combined it with using data that was gathered from the survey, put those 2 pieces of information together here on these slides. So there's actually 2 pieces that we're going to talk about. And Simon, if I could ask, would you mind taking Title 22 and I'll take Title 5? I'm going to help my office mate here find something else to do.
So as Gina was saying, based on the feedback the numbers we ran in this deck today are all based on that MIT Living Wage Calculator rather than the cost of quality survey response. And so you see them here, the data based on for the Title 22 program. And the way this is done is that the lowest paid person in the program and the teaching staff, the assistant teacher, that is the line that is the MIT Living Wage Calculator position based on actually looking at the actual household composition data for assistant teachers, which came from the Berkeley Center's database. And so that is where you have the different regional living wage estimate based on those of you who are familiar with the living wage calculator know that you have to kind of say a particular, household size and how many kids you have, etc. So we use the data on actual composition for the assistant teacher position. And then the other positions are adjusted proportionally based on other survey data and other data we have on, generally how much more a lead teacher makes than an assistant teacher and a program director, etc. And so those numbers are adjusted accordingly. And yes, the Bay Area program director number is incorrect. It should not be 100. It should not be 40,316. They are not working lower than anyone else, so we will make that change.
Thanks, Simon.
Yeah.
When someone starts to stand on a wheelie chair, it does feel like as a parent, you should attend that moment in time. even if you're capable. The one piece on this that is split out at the bottom is the financial manager and the administrative assistant, because as part of thinking about using the living wage calculator, what we used for those positions, because obviously centers have these additional staffing positions, we used BLS salary data for these positions because they map a little bit more neatly to the BLS and tend to have a little less issue with turnover in the positions. So that, just to be clear on the fact that those two positions at the bottom are not related to the structure for living wage and the increases in positions that have increased responsibility that Simon just walked you through.
And so the Bay Area number should be, it's just missing the 100. It should be 140,316. Just check that in the database.
So we'll get it updated before the deck goes out to everyone. So similar approach to going through salaries that are informing the Title V base assumptions and the information that we're going to be looking at today. So the slide looked exactly the same purple, same layout, all of those pieces, but we did move from Title 22 salaries to Title V salaries based on the data that we gathered through the survey process. Because we were able to split data on whether programs were funded by Title 22 or Title V, we were able to look at what the sort of typical difference in salary was between a program that's only Title 22 and a program that's Title V funded. And that bore out to be a 23% difference or increase in salaries. So these Title V salaries are 23% higher than the comparable positions in the salary selection for Title 22 only programs. Same approach where the lowest paid position in the teaching or content area of positions is based on the MIT living wage calculator, using that approach to family composition that was captured for the teacher assistant position in the California childcare workforce. So you just see the difference between is that 23%. And so these are higher salaries for the Title V input. And something we didn't look at last week was the breakdown of non-personnel for amounts for centers. And then we're going to look at those enhancement variables. So as we talked about, non-personnel is obviously a big part of a overall cost of operating a childcare program. And as I mentioned, we had lots and lots of lines, more than 30 discrete individual non-personnel lines. We organize those into a couple different ways. We translate them into a per child value, and then we also organize them into big categories you see here. So all of those lines, like in the occupancy, includes rent and mortgage. It includes utilities. It can even include things like homeowners insurance can be in there. It can include landscaping, snow removal, sort of anything related to maintaining the space or facility that the care is delivered in, whether it's a center or a home, is rolled up in that occupancy line. So you're not seeing all of those 30 to 40 lines. You're instead seeing one big category with multiple lines organized underneath it. And we organize them into per child because then, as we talked about last week, there was a question on sort of, would this go up if you served more children? It's a per child calculation. This is the annual amount for these non-personnel amounts per child. The more children you serve, the multiplier then is higher. If you serve 10 children, it's 10 multiplied by, let's take the 6,000 for the first region. If you serve 100 children, it's 100 multiplied by 6,000. So obviously your non-personnel expenses do go up in how the model functions based on the number of served. So that's the relationship between these values. These are just the values for non-personnel at that single unit of the per child. And again, for centers, we'll look at the family childcare as well. The other piece that we were not able to talk through last week, but sort of we knew that it was the foundation of how the model was functioning, and we wanted to put it in front of you this morning, is the idea of the variables. So these are those elements that you can turn on and select in how the model functions. And what we wanted to share, because we've discussed these at length as a work group in the May and June meetings, is what those enhancements are for Title 22 and Title V. And you'll see that the category of the base variable are the same. Both programs, Title 22 or Title 5, have the same set of variables that are included in their base rate calculation. The amount, the number assigned to a variable may differ between Title 22 and Title 5. It doesn't in all instances. If you look at discretionary benefits, which is about kind of midway down the chart in the compensation area, discretionary benefits in the cost model there's two big values to it. The first is the amount for discretionary benefits as a pool of funds, which can be used to pay for health insurance or retirement benefits. And that's at that $5,931. That's the same amount in Title 22 and in Title 5 base model. The paid time off, 20 days, same thing. That's the same amount in Title 22 versus Title 5. If we look then further down the chart, you actually start to see that while, again, the base variable, the concept is the same of having training hours and having planning time, for instance, if we go to the next row, the amount of training hours and the amount of planning time differs between Title 22 and Title 5. And that is because of the fact that Title 5 has increased regulations or requirements in those areas of the variables. So in the case of just looking at that training, professional development line, the first line of that or training has 21 hours annually per teaching position in the Title 22 program, as well as the director, since that's a licensing requirement. And then Title 5 has 32 hours annually. If you remember from our discussions about how models function, we then take these hours and multiply them by an hourly amount for a floater or a substitute in order for there to be coverage for the program, on the idea that a teacher that needs 21 hours a year should not be doing those hours on their personal time because they're not able to get the release time from the classroom. That instead that needs to be built into how we understand the expense of operating a childcare program, that there should be coverage so that teachers can get their training hours that are required while they're in their work day. And so that's how we translate, that's how we make that into an expense, which then shows up in the cost per child. Same thing with those 5 hours a week of planning time or 10 hours a week for Title 5. Those are translated into a substitute or floater line. And we use the word somewhat interchangeably because it's a hourly amount that the person is paid to be there for those 5 hours a week. And so it doesn't matter what a program calls the individual, it's about having the expense be in the cost model. And we take the 5 hours and then multiply it by that cost of having the substitute or floater available to provide that planning time for the teaching staff in the program. And so the same sort of holds true if you look down, continue down the chart for Title 25 and Title 5, is that there are child education and development supports in the base quality. There are child health dollars in the base quality. There's an operating reserve for both program types in the base quality. So these are all of the variables or assumptions that were selected in running the cost per child scenarios that we looked at last week and that we're about to look at here in a second. But we just didn't unpack them this way together. All right, so we're going to take a quick look at the same values for family childcare before we look at the center-based scenarios. So same information for family childcare, but on one slide. So we've got the salary information or position costs for family childcare on the same slide as those non-personnel values. And it does happen to include family childcare and FFN on this slide. So if we start at the chart at the top, you see using, again, the MIT living wage calculator only as the salary point that we're running in these particular scenarios. And the same approach is used, that the assistant or floater position, which is the lowest paid position in the program, is based on the living wage calculator for that individual or that position in that region of the state. And that is actually the same value for teacher assistants across whether it's family childcare or centers. Where this then differs, we use the same approach where we use data to inform the difference between the assistant teacher and what the owner provider position needs to be paid at. But we use that from our family childcare data collection in the survey. So the difference between these two positions is the information that we gathered through the surveys on the difference between the desired salary for a owner and that of their assistant, the percentage difference. We then applied that percentage to the living wage, because instead of applying it to the sort of current wage or what an assistant is, what they're able to currently pay an assistant, but we applied that percentage increase. So it's similar approach, different data source, because we used family childcare data compared to center-based data on the earlier slides that we were speaking about. There is not a difference in wage information for Title 22 and Title 5 for family childcare or FFN settings. Obviously not for FFN, but for family childcare. And the main reason for that part of this particular assumption right now is that there's not a requirement of more qualifications or experience that's required to be a family childcare funded by Title V. So that's why there's only one set of salary assumptions. Then the next thing that you see is the non-personnel information. And same as what we were just looking at, that the non-personnel information is in big buckets. It is per child, an annual amount. And the amount that is then built when the model uses this information, the amount of total non-personnel that comes into play will depend on the number of children that are served by the program. So the annual amount per child for family childcare non-personnel is the same for a small or a large home, but a large home has up to 14 children that it's serving, small home has up to 8. So the total personnel expenses are different across a small and a large home, but the per child cost of it showed up as the same. And then you do see that there was a handful of things that were collected from FFN providers around some of their sort of most common expenses that they have in the area of non-personnel. And those are the values per child for family, friend, and neighbor care settings that are also then used in the model. And it's same way, we only run one family childcare or FFN scenario in this instance for one group size of children, but the number of children that are in that scenario that are multiplied by that amount per child that you see for non-personnel. Just checking, see if there's any questions. So then last piece before we start to look at scenarios together are the base variables. And this is the same approach that we just talked through with centers, except for related to family childcare. And in the case of family childcare, after all the different variables that are available are turned on, there is family childcare that is Title 22 should actually be in the header next to that, as opposed to a family childcare meeting Title V regulations, in addition to meeting Title 22 regulations. So again, you see several places where the amount is the same, and then you see places where it starts to differ. So the same items are selected, but the value that's assigned to the items in the cost model is different. So 16 hours of annual training compared to 32 hours to meet Title V regulations. So you can kind of move down and see that there are a few different places where the value, because the Title V regulations requires more of the family childcare, is higher for the base variable. Same base variables are turned on for either setting, whether it's Title 22 or programs that are meeting Title V regulations. And those programs that are meeting Title V regulations, you hear them referred to as a Family Childcare Home Education Network member or a FETCHN member or a FETCHN site. That's what is meant by that last column, is that those programs meet Title V regulations and they function as part of a FETCHN to receive the contract payment, and then they meet these requirements as part of their FETCHN role. All right, so the thing that you've all been waiting for, let's talk scenarios with updated results and some juxtaposition against available revenue. This is sort of the part that everybody likes the most.
Okay, I'm going to walk us through the center scenarios. As long as my voice holds up, I'm recovering from COVID, so that is why I was not with you on camera last week. Happy to be with you today. So the scenarios we ran are the same sort of base scenarios as last time, but just kind of updated. The main big thing we did, if we go to the next slide to start looking at center scenario number 1, is that we only ran them with the MIT living wage calculator salaries. We did not run the cost equality desired salaries, given the sort of particular concerns that were raised with those, which we certainly understood. So what you see here, it makes it a bit simpler. We're going to show just the living wage calculator salaries. So on the first scenario, this is a center that meets Title 22 that serves children birth through school age. The total capacity of this program is 78 children, and that's across 4 classrooms. So there's 1 infant classroom, 1 toddler classroom, a preschool classroom, and then a school age classroom. And you can see the maximum capacity there on the slide. In terms of the variables that meet, now this is, looking at that other purple slide that Gina shared a moment ago, the base variables, it's the sort of what we're calling sort of base quality as opposed to Title 5. So this is base Title 22 program. So all of those things that were back on slide 12 are sort of turned on essentially in the model for the scenario. And like I said, the living wage calculator, so those salaries we showed you earlier, it has the paid time off and some money for discretionary benefits. What the scenario plays out with in terms of total staffing is 14.3 full-time equivalent, in terms of staffing, and that includes a director, the assistant director, financial manager, admin assistant, and teaching staff. The total teaching staff is 10.8. And again, that point is because of having the floaters in there for the coverage, for the additional activities to give that release time. So this next chart is the updated version of what we shared last week. So with the updated cost per child numbers in. So a reminder, these are annual numbers. So this is the annual estimated cost per child for this particular center meeting Title 22 requirements, a program size of 74, serving children birth through school age. And you can see we put the total expense line on there again so that you can see that what is actually costing the program to run, that is the revenue that the program needs to generate in order to operate. And so, that's an updated chart from last time. Not going to spend a ton of time on that. The numbers are slightly different with some of the updates we made, but they're in the sort of same ballpark as where they were. The next slide is where we start to get to some of the new content. And this is where we were able to put up those numbers from the prior slide and actually compare them to the potential revenue that a program can get. And so what you see on the blue bars here is that estimated cost per child from the prior slide put up against what is the annual RMR before that region. This chart is for an infant. And so we were able to look at the RMR data and create an average for that region based on the counties in that region. And so what you can see here is in all cases, obviously the purple bar, the amount of revenue you can get for that Title 22 program is significantly lower than the estimated cost, which is shown from the blue bar. And you can see how that differs across the regions of the state, right? So even though the cost at Region 5 in our estimates is lower, there is still a big gap between the 16,014 annual RMR estimate RMR there versus the 26,416 estimated cost. We did look at what the sort of highest RMR was in each of the regions. And, we're not displaying that data just in the context of not putting out a million charts, but, in all cases because these costs are so much higher than the RMR, in all cases, the cost was still showing higher than even the highest RMR reimbursement rate in the particular region. So this chart is infants. The next chart is toddlers. And as Gina said, we were just literally finishing these slides this morning. So we will get these out to you so you can dig into them deeper, but wanted to sort of orientate them to you now. So this is toddlers, so very similar picture, but maybe slightly less gaps. The next slide is preschool. which again, we kept the axis on the left at the same level, the 45,000, so you can kind of see where it's comparing, and you can sort of see the gaps are different across there. So what you start to see here is on preschool, you're getting a little closer, but still obviously big gaps. And then the final chart in this section on the school age, the comparison here on the school age, just a reminder of the way we are talking about school age in this is that we do an annual average, right, which accounts for the fact that for some months of the year, the school age is a full-time rate, is a full-time cost. For some parts of the year, it is a part-time cost because the children are actually in school, so they're only in the childcare program for the before or after school care. So we present an annual number, but that is to be able to average it out across the year. And so the same is done on the rate to be able to do a fair comparison there. So then the next scenario is the Title V scenario. So, otherwise very similar in terms of now this is Title V, it's a birth to school age program. This program serves 110 children. It's actually got 5 classrooms, 18 infants, 16 toddlers. There's 2 preschool classrooms for a total of 48, and then 1 school age classroom for 28. In terms of variables, it's the Title V base. So when you go back to that earlier purple chart, it's the second column in there. Otherwise, same compensation, the MIT living wage calculator, but recall those salaries were about 23% higher than they were in the Title 22 based on our data collection. We made that adjustment. And the staffing in this is obviously a little higher. They have 25.6 full-time staff, of which 21.6 are classroom staff, and that's accounting for different ratios, and also obviously this is a larger program. So the next slide shows the chart of the results again, so similar to last time, just with some slight updates, and you see we put the new date on the bottom there. And with the total expenses. So these are those revised numbers. And then we did the same in terms of comparison to revenue, and now obviously compared it to SRR rates and did it for all of the different age groups. And so this first one here is the comparison to the SRR for infants. Of course, there is not a regional adjustment to the SRR. So that's the green line, the green bar there, the SRR is the same across the regions, but we put it out there separately so you can see the comparison in each of the different regions. And showing that, of course, even though the SRR is, higher than the RMR, the cost is, of course, higher in this scenario. So the gap still exists there. The toddler slide is next. Similar gaps still there, if not slightly bigger. And then preschool, we ran those numbers, looking at the SRR for CSPP, and those numbers you can see there as well. And then finally, school age. And then, we kept the 70,000 axis on the side there again, just to sort of, so that the charts can be compared to each other. Smaller gaps on school age, but only really small when you can compare them to the other ages. They continue to be gaps there. What we did do is put all this together to sort of show all those gaps, right? So when you get these slides and you can look into them deeper, you can sort of estimate these gaps yourself. But on the next slide here, what we did was we put up the comparison of the difference between the cost of quality numbers and the RMR or the SRR by region.
We have one question from Virginia, or flag from Virginia. So we did take into account the increases that were effective January 1st, and we did also look across that idea of 75th percentile of the RMR or the previous SRR. So the phrasing in the last memo that we used still used the term SRR. So if what you're calling out is the reference to SRR, we use the information that was accurate. The reference to SSR we can change, obviously, that reference. But we used the information on the funding levels that was the most up to date on these Title V.
Well, the reason I asked, and I know the preschool rate's better, but if you go back to the preschool rates, then that can maybe be a little bit more helpful. But it looks to me like all of the rates that are reflected for the SR are the same in every region. However, with the changes that were made for the Title V rates, thank you, Donna. I think we try very hard not to use the word SRR anymore for the Title V contractors because it's confusing. So if you want to call it the Title V rate instead, maybe I really like that suggestion, Donna. So there should be regional variations. So I was just sort of typing to sort of process what was here, but this doesn't look right to me, what we're comparing it to.
We have to look into each county's RMR rate to see if there is a total regional variation. That's where we ended up with not seeing if there maybe was one county within a region that the rate was going to be higher, that didn't apply to the whole region. That's why it wasn't fair to put that rate there. Right. So that's why we erred on the side of this and acknowledge, as Simon said, there may be instances where in a given county, they may be paid higher than this, but not the whole region is. So that's the hair we're splitting. So we'd have to break it down by county to do that.
Yeah. And maybe there's some sort of weighted average we can do based on subsidized children served. I just want to make sure that people know that rates, do currently vary by region, at least somewhat. But we did have those increases in January. And so that we are looking at where that got us as part of this conversation.
Great. Thanks, Virginia.
And we have those contract rates on our website for preschool, so we can provide those if helpful.
Sure. And so just this last slide, and then we can address, I know there's another question in there. So this slide gives you the gap. So, from each of those prior 8 slides that we shared, 8 charts we shared, you can estimate, what is the actual gap between the cost of quality and the current public funding available, be it the RMR or the Title V rate. Did I get that right? And so this shows you, what this is helpful to do is to look at sort of where are those gaps biggest, right? So obviously on the RMR piece, on the Title 22 piece, which is the blue charts at the top of the page here, the biggest gaps are, for infants, regions, the gaps are largest for the younger children. Not a surprise to any of you who've been, paying attention in the last few months, right? I know this industry, obviously, that is where the gaps are biggest, where the difference between what families can afford to pay and what it actually costs is the largest, and that's reflected in the RMR. The purple at the bottom shows you this for the Title V rates, which there is less of that differentiation by age, but it gives you a sense of this is the sort of gap, essentially, right? When we talk about the cost, if the state were to move to paying on cost of quality, this is the sort of gap that exists right now between the RMR, the Title V rates, and the estimated cost of quality based on these specific scenarios, right? And can't reiterate that enough that these are 2 specific scenarios we are running. Obviously, size of program, ages of children served can have a big impact on those costs as well. But this is the illustration from those 2 scenarios. Robin, to address your question about why the Title V Southern rates went down since last week, I don't know how much they went down exactly without looking back. Some things changed based on where we categorized some of the non-personnel expenses, where we found, I think you might all remember from last week, we talked about having 5 days to turn the survey results into the numbers, and I was sick through some of that. So we were able to do some sort of refining and data checking this week, and so some of it could be reflected based on that. Okay, other questions on centers, or we can move on to family childcare, and then of course can always have more questions at the end as we come back to them. Okay, I'll pass it to Gina to walk us through the family childcare.
So similar approach that we're going to go through this two scenarios, the Title 22 program meeting base quality and the family child care settings meeting Title V regulations, or those in fetch-in settings. And then we're going to look at the output. So we're going to just quickly review the details of what went into the scenario itself. So in similar fashion, it's a birth to school age program. There is two different capacities being ran in the charts that we're going to look at: a small home serving 8 children and a large home serving 14 children. And so as we've talked about before, we know that both centers and family childcares may have more children enrolled than they're serving at a given point in time. In the model, we run that point in time service that aligns with what is allowed for our licensing, sort of in the room, in the facility, in the home at a moment in time. There is the option within how the model functions to understand total enrollment and the costs that may come with total enrollment, because obviously there's things like paying for educational materials for all children, which if you enroll 27 children and only serve 14 at a given time, your expense could be higher. But right now we're focusing on the scenario of at that point in time service. Again, we're only running the position costs or compensation using the MIT living wage calculator information that we looked at in the purple section of the deck. And then the other pieces around discretionary benefits and those other elements of variables, this is that base quality column, not the meeting Title V regulations, but the base quality column. We did, again, the summary of what staffing then looks like for the small home or the large home. And in the small home, there's the one owner provider, which is of course required by licensing. The additional staffing or support that comes with the model in this scenario of the meeting base quality includes 25 hours a week of support time for the delivery of the service in the small family childcare home. And it also includes 5 hours a week of time for planning and sort of educational and child development supports for serving the young children. Those are the same values, the 25 hours a week and the 5 hours a week in the large home. The additional staffing in the large home is the full-time assistant that's required with licensing. So that's the difference. And you see the total staffing across the two is where it comes into play. So similar to what we looked at last week, this is only the one set of salary input, the MIT living wage salary input, and the charts in the sense of that they're laid out exactly the same. Top chart is for the small home serving 8 children. The chart in the lower half of the deck, the slide, is for the large home serving up to 14 children. What you see are the costs per child, of course, by the age of the child. And then you see the total annual expenses that program. So that sort of speaks to that concept of what is the total in for a program to actually cover. That's the total cost of serving 8 kids at those different costs per child. It costs between $233,000 to $365,000 a year. You could also think about that as the amount of revenue that the program needs to bring in order to cover those cost per child values based on, again, all those inputs and assumptions that are made in running the model. I raise that or sort of highlight that as we look at the small versus large home, because when you go to then the bottom chart, you see that the cost per child is a little bit lower for serving 14 children than 8. And that has a lot to do with serving 14 children instead of 8. And when you're dividing the expenses by the number of children, you're dividing by 14 instead of 8. But you see the total annual expenses, the last row, is greater. Obviously, the total annual expenses of a large home that serves 14 children is more than a small home that's serving 8 children. So I just wanted to highlight that. There's a little bit of economy of scale that comes with serving 6 more kids, even though you also have the addition of a full-time assistant. The expense of the full-time assistant does not outweigh having the additional children in the setting. All right, so then let's compare these same rates or cost per child information to the available revenue. So this one has a little more going on the chart in part, so sort of bear with us for a second, in part because of the nature of family childcare, right? There's the nature of the cost for an infant, toddler, and preschooler it's the same cost is how it bears out in the model, because there's not different expenses assigned to an infant, toddler, or preschooler. So you see all three on the same. The small home is the lighter yellow bar, the expense for the small home. The large home expense is the darker yellow, the more golden color is the large home. So expense are the two taller bars, and again, they're laid out by the 5 regions. Then the purple and blue bars, which are much shorter on the chart, are the available revenues. So the available revenues via the regional market rate for an infant is the purple column in all the regions. And then the available revenues for a preschooler is the blue column, again, in all regions. So you see, same as what we were just looking at with Simon in the center-based, is that there is not a scenario. And we know this even from, these are regions where we did gather all the RMRs together. There's not an instance even in the region where there's a higher amount paid to a given area of the region where the amount that's paid, that's available to fund a child is more or close to the expense of the large and small family childcare home. So let's take a quick look at the results for the school-aged, because in the case of the school-aged, because of the fact that they are not, while they may be served, as Simon mentioned, they may be served at times of the year full-time. Most of the year, they are not served with a full-time day, the same way that a preschool or an infant or a toddler is. So there is a different revenue amount. So we adjust the revenue that's available for school age to account for the percentage of time that the child is in care. And so you see the difference between, and again, same approach here, that the yellow first column of the 2 yellow gold columns is the small home. The next one over is the large home. So a little bit less cost per child for the large home for a school age child. And then purple is the available revenue for a school age child. So again, same scenario, that there's quite a gap between the cost and the available revenue. So let's take a quick look at the next scenario in family childcare, which is meeting Title V regulations. And again, these would typically be family childcare programs that are part of a FETCHN or Family Childcare Home Education Network. There are some differences in what's required of programs that are in FETCHN. The number of children, 8 or 14, remains the same. Serving children birth through school aged, that's kept consistent. The programs are meeting Title V regulations, which is different than meeting the base quality of a Title 22 program. So that's one set of variables that are different. And we saw that on the purple comparison chart. And then if you look down at the staffing changes a little bit in that very last item in the list of staffing. There's the required by licensing, the owner, and then the owner assistant for a large home. There's the additional 25 hours a week of support time for the responsibilities of running the home. Item is the hours a week of support that supports the provider in being able to do planning and what we refer to as release time for center-based programs. It's 7.5 hours for a small home that meets Title V regulations and 10 hours a week of time for a large home that meets Title V regulations, because release time is given to both the owner and the assistant to be able to do planning for individualized instruction for the children. So that's the main difference that you're seeing there. So all those things come together to impact the cost per child, and the cost per child is higher for family childcare programs, whether small or large, meeting family childcare home education network regulations or Title V regulations under a FETCHN. And so that's what lays out here, is that you're seeing that the amounts are a little bit higher at cost per child, and you see the total annual expense is also higher. Just from memory of the slide we were just looking at, in the northern region, for instance, small home, the total expenses was closer to 233, and here it's coming in at 241. So there are expenses that are greater related to being in a FETCHN program. So let's take a look at the revenue related to these things. So took a slightly different approach with this one and how it's laid out. Oops, sorry, a little bit of trigger happy. Took a slightly different approach. This is all related to the comparison of the cost per child for small and large homes to the available rate that can be paid. So this is the Title V rate that can be paid for an infant, which reads right now as infant SRR, but read with us that it says infant Title V rate. So again, same approach by region, that the paler yellow is the small home cost per child. The more golden color is the large home cost per child. And then what you see, instead of stacking another bar related to revenue, is you see a line related to the revenue that's available to cover the cost of that infant in that family childcare setting. And in this instance, it's just over $31,000 for the cost. So this is the first time that you'll see from a regional perspective that there is an instance where a large home with all of the factors that the assumptions that we made in the model actually is made whole by the SRR if they're being reimbursed by the SRR or the Title V rate, sorry. All right, so this was the infant slide. Let's take a look at the toddler comparison chart. Again, same approach in that there's the pale yellow is the small home, darker gold color is the large home. So again, the small homes cost a little bit more annual cost per child than the large home does. This is for a toddler. And so you see in the instance here for a toddler, because the revenue amount that's available under Title V for a toddler in a family childcare home is lower than the amount that's available to pay for an infant, that in this instance, they're all the cost per child amounts are not covered by the available revenue under the Title V rate for a toddler, the $23,000. It's not my Teresa. She's in another floor making noise. All right, so let's take a look at the preschool for the same approach. And this obviously is 3s and 4s together, looking at the cost per child here for preschool age children, and then the available payment rate under Title V or CSPP is the 12,000 line here that you see down here. Oh, I'm gonna just check in on the questions that maybe we're getting. Oh, just about the slides, okay. Got it.
I think Donna's got her hand raised too, is that?
Oh, go ahead, Donna.
I have to open my camera and everything. The Title V rates for family childcare, assuming a network, this is just the rate that would go to the provider, correct? The administration of the program is above and beyond that.
Yes. Yeah, yes. But this is the rate that's paid for a fetch-in slot.
That should go directly to the provider. And then the administration part of it should be separate.
So the expense is meeting fetch-in regulations and calculating them. They may not, and we've talked about this at one of the meetings last week, that it may not be the instance that the family childcare provider is always the one meeting all of the regulations alone, that they may, for instance, their DRDPs may be done by their fetch-in staff support, but the expense of that is in right now as a cost per child expense, because we built in all the expenses of meeting Title V regulations, regardless of who does the activity. So that's something that you would have to sort of peel off. From the revenue side, this is the revenue that's on paper. Now, if that revenue comes in currently to the fetch-in to administer, and the fetch-in administers a portion of the revenue out to the program, that we're not taking that into consideration. We're just using the amount with the adjustment factor for infants, toddlers, and preschoolers that the Title V rate is that is available to be paid to a family child care provider meeting Title V regulations. I may be making too much of your question, but I wanted to make sure.
No, thank you. That's helpful.
I think split the revenue.
You know, there's a lot of complications around family child care networks, and right now we have 2 different separate funding structures, and in one of them, the provider often is left being paid significantly less. And I think we've got to right size all of that in this process. But that's helpful to know. Thank you.
So in this is a perfect example of we're just comparing to one revenue amount per child, right? So there's other comparisons that could be made. All right, so let's take a quick look at school age. And again, same pattern by all 5 regions. The amount for the small home is the first column, large home is the second column in each region, and the black line that cuts across them is the available Title V revenues for a school-age child. All right, so the next thing that we're going to look at in similar fashion to what we looked at with centers is that gap comparison slide. And we thought that this might be helpful too, to have sort of this idea of the gaps all in one place, right? So starting with the small home for Title 22, and then large home is the second part of the slide down there at the bottom, the difference between the Title 22 cost equality and the RMR, these are the different gaps all in one place. So you're seeing them across the different ages of children. And again, the cost per child out of the output from the cost model ultimately is the same for infants, toddlers, and preschoolers. There's a difference for school-age children because of the hours of care, but the rates that are paid for the ages of children differ. So that's why the gap amounts actually differ, because in some instances, you may be doing better based on the payment rate that's available to you for a given cost per child. And then same approach in the deck is then cost of care for meeting Title V regulations or being a fetch-in program, and then the gap from that cost of care compared to the available Title V revenues to cover the expense of the service to the child. I'm not seeing any questions in the chat yet. Then I'm going to move us on to FFN summary, just kind of keeping track of time here. Make sure that we cover it all. You're going to, as we said, you're going to get the slides to spend a little bit more time with. And also don't hesitate to follow up if you have questions for us too. So we ran the same scenario in family, friend, and neighbor as we did in the previous slide deck, birth to school age 13 years. We did 5 children in the care setting and meeting all trust line regulations. So for us to Eric's point about whether or not the state is in compliance, we built in the cost of attending the health and safety trainings that a family, friend, and neighbor care setting needs to meet CCDF regulations. So then you first see the annual cost per child that comes out from the cost model for FFN, of course, by region, and followed the same approach where you see the total annual expenses for serving those 5 children across these cost per child values. Then let's just do a quick comparison to the available revenues currently for FFN compared to the cost per child information. And so you do see that there are some instances where some of the regions are obviously doing a little bit better, like the Bay Area is closer to the cost based on what the FFNs are being paid for toddlers and preschoolers. And then some places are faring worse, like Southern and Los Angeles County too, as well as the Central is sort of even faring worse, Central and Northern comparatively. So this is sort of an example of, especially since this rate currently is based off of the regional market rate for family childcare, that sort of regional market rate being determined by what families can pay, then ends up with an amount as a revenue that looks quite a bit less than what the actual cost is to deliver the service in that community. If you just look at those Central and Northern regional summaries in the gap, or the difference between the cost and the available revenue. This isn't the gap amounts. And then we'll take a quick look at the school age for serving school age children in the family, friend, and neighbor care, and then compared to the available revenue. And that's all for us. Oh, we have one more. We do have a gap slide. I wasn't sure if we had a gap slide for FFN. So this is, again, similar approach to what we talked about with centers and family childcare, that taking all that information on cost compared to the available revenue, and then just putting the gap between cost and available revenue next to each other. So you can take a look at it, how the gap differs by the age of the children that are served. And that in all instances, the gap is that it costs more than programs are being paid to deliver the service. And that is all for us, I promise, this time. So how about we see if there's any questions? Eric's hands up.
Thank you, Gina, for the visual. Maybe it's a visual limitation of me understanding for example, the last slide you showed with the FFN cost, and assuming those gradients are the revenues, I'm not seeing where the cost point is on those visuals. So maybe if that could be pointed out a little bit easier visually, because what I'm seeing is all because there's more than one, you've got 3 infant, toddler, preschool, school age, which I'm assuming is the revenues in the gray bars.
No, yeah, so no, this is just a gap slide. So let's go back a slide. This has cost, 61.25, revenue, 37. The next slide is the difference between 61.25 and 37.94 juxtaposed against each other.
Thank you for clarifying. And I was suggest, and I know it makes it more complicated, but maybe to reduce some additional confusion is if somehow you could combo those slides. So you could actually see, yes, there's the difference, and then what's the difference again on the same slide versus having to make that mental gymnastics to remember that.
Right. Yeah.
Other than that, I'm, as a representative from the central area, and also potentially from the north part, it's pretty sad. And again, as Donna has mentioned in the chat and many others, this does show what the current RMR system has done to the market. Unfortunately, good or bad, this is the result of that decision made decades ago on how it's impacting and keeping the costs down.
Robin?
Thank you. Love the charts. Could we go back to the one that shows for the comparison between Title 22 and Title 5, where it shows training, family engagement, benefits? I have a question on that chart. I don't remember what it was called.
For centers or family childcare, Robin?
Center, Title 5.
Okay.
It compared Title 5 to Title 22.
Yeah. So hold on.
That's the one. Okay, so under Title V, one thing that I love that it's taking into consideration if we pay them, for example, benefits. But I also want to be careful that we're not adding requirements. And so there's 2 things that stood out for me here that are not required annually. So the 32 hours annually for each person under Title V is not required, and neither are 3 conferences. 2 conferences are required. Of course, changing this, I don't want that to reduce the wonderful rate increase that is being proposed, but just to correct that or that we're taking into consideration, obviously, planning time, but if we're talking about a requirement, it's 2 conferences, and I believe Title 22, it's 0 conferences are required. And then the training is really the only time there's a requirement on training is to renew your permit. And so I believe 105 hours every 5 years.
Right. So we're aware of how those things read in regulations, and this was part of the discussion of putting in base quality variables for the 2 things. So
okay, well, those 2 stood out because I just want to make sure that we're not tying you have to do this training or conferences in order to get this new rate, because remember back to the beginning, we wanted to be really careful that we're going to get a new rate based on what we're doing now.
Right. Yep.
Thank you.
Virginia.
Thank you. I just wanted to ask a question, and maybe we could go to the slide that defines the regions, but just talking about that a little bit, and maybe if we could talk about, and I know that this was pulled from the study at Berkeley that already sort of pulled things out into regions, but I also know that when we were on the 2018 RMR work group, and many folks that are in the space were also on that work group, we had a lot of conversations about how there's a lot of variation even within counties on costs. And so there was sort of a feeling that maybe we needed to be looking at a smaller geographical unit than even the county. Now that's hard because of the data we have available. And so, you know, I think just kind of curious about this region level approach, because wanting to flag that, especially, you know, there are going to be some parts of, say, Central that are very close to the Bay Area that may operate more like the Bay Area, and there's some parts that are part of the Central that are close to LA, right? And so how do we, and those are just, you know, a couple of examples. You can imagine a lot more. So if we're not doing a county level estimate, it seems like, you know, and we implement, you know, we saw those gaps. And I think overall, there are a lot of gaps in all regions, but the amount that you're going up to would change depending on which region you're in. So hearing more about the assumptions that are underlaying this regional approach and why this versus a county level one or something that's even more granular would be helpful.
So I will have to leave, and I know that Leah's not here able to join today to speak a little more to how, and I know they have a pretty elaborate approach to how they ended up dividing up the state in this way. So I want to leave that to Leah, and maybe Leah we can flag that for her to share on the August work group meeting. For us, we have a lot of the values at the county level, right? We have MIT living wage calculator values at the county level. So we could be running rates for counties. We, at this point, wanted to keep consistent with another study that had gathered wage information, so we'd be able to have a point of comparison to wages in 2020 and see where you're sort of moving from, you know, as a moving up in wages. But there could be some comparison to those county level revenue rates and expense rates. We would have to run the model differently, but that could be something that we could do in the future.
Okay, so it sounds like this was picked so that we could use the Berkeley data. And I just want to flag that was collected during the fall 2020, so during the pandemic. So that's just something else for all of us to keep in mind as we look at that. But thank you so much, Gina.
Deborah?
Thank you. Thank you. I just want to say thank you for those numbers. Two things come to mind. First of all, I think of these, when I look at these numbers and I say, you know what, right now, we're working off a 2018 RMR. And with these numbers right here, these are current numbers. These are realistic numbers now. We have to make sure that by embracing this information is that we remain current always, and that the state does not allow this information to come in, sit, marinate, and say, now we're going to implement in 2027 the information we got in 2022. I'm asking that we remain current on this type of information and don't fall short by always being paid behind things, which is the history of the state. Also, I want to say is that looking at these numbers, the comparison revenue, it tells us why this industry was crippled during a pandemic and how and why centers, family daycare providers were trying to remain afloat with the income that they receive or that we receive right now, and yet still trying to stabilize ourselves. So these numbers bring a reality to the world that we've known all the time. So thank you for this information. And providers, this is why we need to speak up and show out. Bring the information to the forefront so that the state can see our reality. Closed mouth don't get fed. Thank you.
Thanks, Deborah.
Well, thank you, P5 Fiscal Strategies, as always, for so much tremendous work in such a short amount of time, too. Really, really, really appreciate it. I think with that, we are ready to turn to public comment now. So we're going to open up the chat feature for written public comment, and we're going to enable the virtual raise hand feature for members of the public who would like to get in the virtual line to speak verbally. When I see the virtual hands raised, I'll call on them one at a time and invite you to unmute. Please state your full name and any organizational affiliation you may have. And we would appreciate it if members of the public would raise their hand just as soon as you know you would like to be in the line to speak, so we have a sense of how many we're trying to accommodate. We're going to start off with just allowing 60 seconds of verbal comment, if you wouldn't mind, just so we can accommodate as many people as who may come forward. And there'll be a chime when you have about 10 seconds left so that you know to wrap up your comments. So with that, we'll look to the participant panel, to the attendees tab, looking for virtual raised hands. And I see Kelly Reynolds. We invite you to unmute. Please go ahead.
Good morning, Kelly Reynolds on behalf of Early Edge California. Early Edge appreciates the continued work the Rate and Quality Workgroup is doing to develop a single reimbursement rate system, as well as dress equality standards that have positive effects on children. We support a base rate that takes the existing requirements into account, but also want to see ultimately that the system incentivizes providers to meet additional quality metrics and provide increased rates for achieving those metrics. As the workgroup considers the development of a base rate for FFNs, we want to reiterate that we encourage the work to consider how to define and measure key quality components that we know FFNs provide, such as connection to families and children served, language and cultural responsiveness, and individualized attention. We also want to underscore the comments made earlier about California being out of compliance with CCDBG requirements for FFN care. And as the state considers rates for FFNs, we want to make sure that it includes covering the cost of coming into compliance with federal training requirements and provide FFN supports to do so. Lastly, just want to reiterate, we want to see, continued support for DLLs and children with special needs in this rate structure, and want to thank the work group for streamlining and increasing compensation for early warning and care providers, and look forward to be engaged in this work. Thank you.
Thank you, Kelly. Now we'll invite Annie Locomedes to unmute and go ahead.
Good afternoon. This is Anna Iokimedes with Head Start California. We would like to thank the work group for your efforts to align Head Start and state subsidized programs, and in particular would like to support a recommendation to align state subsidized programs to Head Start by basing funding on enrollment rather than on attendance. Not only is that a huge help to providers, it also helps with blending and leveraging federal funds in our Head Start programs. We look forward to continuing to work with the work group in finding other ways that we can align Head Start programs and make sure that our programs are integrated, and that Head Start, which does serve the most vulnerable children in society, it is ensured to receive an equal wage to state subsidized programs. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Anna. Looking to see any other virtual raised hands? Okay, well, I will note that our next work group meeting is August 12th. I've just put it in the chat, from 8:30 to 11:30. So we look forward to seeing as many of you there as possible. Once again, just really appreciate the investment of time and heart and minds from this work group. And I want to turn things over to Carla to wrap things up. Thank you, Carla.
Thank you, Karen. Just wanted to remind, and actually Robin's asking if the meeting will be in person or via Zoom. Given the COVID numbers going up and wanting to make sure that all our partners that are on the call right now are able to join, it's going to be a Zoom meeting, 8:30 to 11:30. And the hope is to give an overview of the report. West Ed will be reaching out to different work group members to make sure that the report's actually presented by the work group. But at the end of the day, these are recommendations that are from the work group, and we want to make sure that it is you all that are sharing some of this. In addition, from now until that meeting, the reason for the long period of time is we want to make sure that there's a comprehensive review of the draft that you all have received from West Ed. So all that feedback will be taken and making sure that we incorporate it. You'll get a third and final draft of the report the first week of August, last week of August. But very much looking forward to us having that final conversation and landing this plane. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Carla. And with that, we'll adjourn today's meeting. Hope you all have a wonderful day. Thank you. Bye-bye.